The dream always started the same way. Lyra Voss would find herself standing in the amber gallery of the Sereth Imperial Palace, barefoot on tiles so ancient they hummed beneath her skin. The gallery stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with portraits of empresses whose eyes followed her with cold judgment. At the far end, her father knelt on the floor in his worn diplomatic suit, his head bowed, and above him stood Empress Yelvari, tall, silver-skinned, her dark opalescent eyes burning with something that wasn't anger but wasn't mercy either. In the dream, the Empress always spoke a word Lyra couldn't hear, and the entire gallery shattered into light. She woke gasping, as she always did, in the narrow diplomatic quarters on the palace's lowest residential tier. The quarters hadn't changed in 12 years, the same brushed metal walls, the same viewport overlooking the supply yard instead of the crystal gardens, the same faint vibration from the palace's thermal core running through the floor. Her father's boots were already gone from beside the door, which meant he'd risen before the fourth bell again, which meant there was another session of the High Resonance Court today, which meant he'd come back with that quiet stillness in his face that she'd learned to read before she could read Sarathi script. Lyra was 23. She'd arrived on Sereth as an 11-year-old clutching her father's hand, the only human child in a palace that housed 9,000 Sarathi, and regarded both of them as a bureaucratic inconvenience. Consul Marcus Voss, Earth's permanent diplomatic representative to the Sarathi Ascendancy, had been assigned to the post because no one else wanted it. The Sarathi were not hostile. They were not aggressive. They were simply, comprehensively, indifferent to humanity in a way that made hostility feel almost preferable. 12 years of indifference had a texture. Lyra knew it the way she knew the grain of the ancient tiles under her feet. She dressed in the plain gray tunic that diplomatic dependents were permitted, not the deep ambers and golds of Sarathi court dress, not the formal black of a recognized envoy. Gray, the color of furniture. She'd stopped minding it around age 15, which was the same year she'd stopped crying in the washroom after court sessions, where delegates talked through her father as though he were a translation device rather than a person. The fourth bell rang as she crossed the processional bridge toward the Court of Echoes. 2 Sarathi guards flanked the entrance, tall, lean, their pale jade skin catching the morning light through the crystal dome overhead. Their dark reflective eyes tracked her without acknowledgement. She was known. She was permitted. She was not greeted. Inside the Court of Echoes, the day's session had already begun. The court was a vast circular chamber, tiered like an amphitheater, with the Empress's dais at the center, a raised platform of black stone carved with the resonance glyphs of every ruling house in the Ascendancy's 4,000-year history. The seats were filled with regents, house speakers, military advisors, trade delegates, and the usual constellation of lesser officials who attended primarily to be seen attending. Perhaps 300 Sarathi in formal court dress, their silver and jade and deep blue skin tones creating a mosaic of alien beauty that still caught Lyra's breath even after all these years. Her father sat at the outermost ring, in the chair designated for the human consulate. It was positioned behind a support column that partially blocked his view of the dais. The placement had been corrected 4 times in 12 years. Each time it migrated back within a season. Marcus Voss sat in it with the same posture he always carried, straight-backed, hands folded, his weathered face composed. He was 51 now, his dark hair shot through with gray at the temples, the lines around his eyes deeper than they'd been when they'd arrived. He wore his formal suit, the only one he had, mended at the elbows twice, and his expression was the one Lyra thought of as his listening face. Attentive, patient. A man who had spent 12 years being spoken past and had never once raised his voice about it. Lyra took her seat beside him. He glanced at her, and the corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. She pressed her shoulder against his for a moment. Their private language, "I'm here." The session's business was routine for the first hour: trade allotments for the Outer Ring colonies, a boundary dispute between House Melvari and House Toreth, a petition from the Resonance Physicians Guild regarding funding for the Neural Frequency Mapping Project. Lyra followed the proceedings in Sarathi. She was fluent now, more fluent than any other human alive, though no one in the court had ever acknowledged this, and kept her own notes in a small bound journal her father had given her years ago. Halfway through the trade allotments, a minor delegate from House Toreth, a young Sarathi with deep blue skin, and the careful posture of someone navigating their first court session, dropped a date, a cylinder. It rolled across the stone floor toward the outermost ring, coming to rest against Marcus's boot. He picked it up and held it out. The delegate crossed the floor, took it, and walked away without a word or a glance. Lyra recorded the moment in her journal. Entry 4,612 of incidents exactly like it. She'd stopped being angry about them years ago. Anger required the expectation of something better, and expectations were a luxury the outermost ring didn't afford. It was during the physician's petition that the first crack appeared. The Empress was not present. This was unusual. Empress Yelvari had not missed a session of the High Resonance Court in the 19 years of her reign. Her dais sat empty, the obsidian throne catching light from the dome, but holding no one. The regent steward, an older Sarathi named Counselor Drethani, presided from a secondary platform, and his manner was the particular kind of smooth that Lyra had learned meant something was being concealed. She leaned toward her father. "Where is she?" Marcus shook his head once. "Third day," he murmured, barely moving his lips. 3 days absent. Lyra's pulse quickened. In 12 years she had never known the Empress to miss a single session. She looked at the faces around the court, the regents, the House speakers, and saw what her father had already seen: the careful blankness that Sarathi wore when they were frightened. The session ended early. The delegates filed out in their usual hierarchical order: regents first, then House speakers, then military, then trade, then foreign representatives last. Lyra and her father waited in their seats until the chamber was nearly empty, as protocol demanded. A Sarathi aide passed them without a word, collecting document cylinders from the abandoned seats, and Lyra watched her father's face as the aide moved on. The same composed patience, the same willingness to be last. It was that willingness that had defined Marcus Voss's 12 years on Sarath. Lyra remembered the first time she'd understood what her father was doing here. She'd been 14, sitting in on a trade negotiation, where the Sarathi delegate had spent 3 hours addressing the wall behind Marcus's head rather than making eye contact. Afterward, walking back to their quarters, she'd asked him why he didn't demand to be treated as an equal. "Because demanding it doesn't make it real," he'd said. "Being steady does. They'll see it when they're ready." She'd thought he was foolish then. At 23, she thought he might have been the bravest person she'd ever known, and also the most stubborn, and also possibly right, though the evidence for that last part remained thin. What she had not told him, what she had not told anyone, was that she'd started hearing things. Not voices, not words, something subtler and stranger, a low harmonic in the palace walls, a vibration in the crystal domes that seemed to shift when she walked beneath them, a faint pulse in the meditation gardens that rose and fell like breathing. She'd noticed it first at 13, dismissed it as the hum of the thermal core, and then noticed that no one else seemed to hear it. By 16, she could distinguish individual tones, higher registers, that seemed to cluster around certain Sarathi, lower ones that pooled in the ancient stones of the Court of Echoes. By 20, she'd realized that what she was hearing was the resonance field itself, the neural frequency network that connected every Sarathi mind in the Ascendancy, and that she was, impossibly, tuned to it. She told herself it was imagination. She told herself it was loneliness wearing the mask of belonging. She kept it in the same locked place where she kept the dream about the Amber Gallery, and she did not mention it to her father, because Marcus Voss had enough impossible things to carry without adding his daughter's auditory hallucinations to the list. The evidence began to thicken 2 days later. A summons arrived at the diplomatic quarters before the second bell, a sealed resonance scroll, the kind used only for communications from the Empress's own household. Marcus broke the seal with steady hands while Lyra watched from the doorway. She saw his face change. Not dramatically, her father's face never changed dramatically, but the stillness in it shifted from patient to alert, the way a compass needle settles when it finds true north. "We've been asked to attend a private audience," he said, "both of us." Both. Lyra had never been formally summoned anywhere. She was a dependent, a gray tunic. "The scroll names you specifically. Lyra Voss, daughter of the human consul." They walked the processional bridge together, this time ascending to the upper tiers of the palace, past the crystal gardens and the meditation halls and the resonance chambers where Sarathi physicians mapped the neural frequencies of their species' collective consciousness. Lyra had never been above the 7th tier. The scroll granted them passage to the 14th, the Empress's private level. The guards here were different, taller, their jade skin darker, almost emerald. They wore ceremonial armor inlaid with amber that caught the light and threw it in fractures across the corridor walls. One of them read the scroll, looked at Marcus, looked at Lyra, and stepped aside without speaking. The private audience chamber was small, perhaps the size of the diplomatic quarters' main room, which Lyra found oddly grounding. Stone walls, undecorated. A single window overlooking the crystal gardens from above, flooding the room with morning light. And in the center, in a chair that was not a throne but carried the weight of one, sat Empress Yelvari. Lyra had seen her from the outermost ring of the Court of Echoes for 12 years, a distant figure of silver skin and dark authority. Up close, the Empress was smaller than she'd imagined. The silver blue of her skin was finely textured, almost luminous, and her long white hair fell past her shoulders in a single wave. Her eyes, those vast, dark, reflective Sarathi eyes, were the same ones from Lyra's dream, but they weren't burning now. They were tired. Deeply, anciently tired. And they were looking at Marcus Voss, with an expression Lyra had never seen on a Sarathi face. "Recognition." "Consul," the Empress said. Her voice was quieter than it was in the court, and Lyra realized that the courtroom voice was the performance. This was real. "Sit, please, and your daughter." 2 chairs had been placed across from her, not behind a column, not at the edge, directly facing the Empress at the same height, the same distance. Lyra sat and felt something shift in her chest that she couldn't name. "You've been on Sarath for 12 years, Yelvari said, addressing Marcus. It wasn't a question. 12 years, 3 months, and 14 days, your resonance. In that time, you have submitted 411 diplomatic briefs to this court. How many received a formal response?" Marcus paused. Lyra knew the number. She'd counted once in a fit of teenage anger that had lasted 3 days. 7, her father said. 7, the Empress repeated the word as though tasting it. "In 12 years, and you stayed." "Yes, your resonance." "Why?" The question hung in the air. Lyra watched her father's face, the weathered lines, the gray temples, the steady eyes that had looked at 12 years of indifference without flinching. She saw him consider the question not as a diplomat, but as a man being asked to account for the central act of his life. "Because the post matters," he said, "whether anyone acknowledges it or not." The Empress was silent for a long moment. Then she did something Lyra had never seen a Sarathi monarch do, not in 12 years, not in any recording, not in any historical text she'd studied. She inclined her head, not a full bow, but a visible, deliberate tilt of acknowledgement. 7 responses in 12 years, Yelvari said, and not one of them was from me. I owe you an explanation for that, Consul, but first, I owe you the truth about why you're here today. She lifted her hand and drew back the sleeve of her robe. Beneath the fabric, Her forearm was marked with dark lines, not decorative, not ceremonial. Medical lines. Resonance decay markers that Lyra recognized from her studies of Sarathi biology. The branching patterns of a neural frequency that was losing coherence. "I'm dying," the Empress said. The word landed in the small room like a stone in still water. The resonance physicians diagnosed it 11 days ago. Synaptic dissolution, the governing frequency that connects the Empress to the Ascendancy's collective consciousness, is fragmenting. It cannot be repaired. The process will take between 2 and 6 months. I will lose coherence gradually, then completely, and when my frequency goes silent, the throne of echoes will need a successor. Marcus said nothing. He waited. Lyra realized she'd stopped breathing and forced herself to inhale. "There are 9 claimants," Yalvari continued. "The regents have been positioning their houses for years, anticipating this possibility. The succession will be contested. 3 of the 9 claimants have private military forces. 2 have already begun making alliances with the Outer Ring colonies. If I announce my diagnosis publicly, the maneuvering will become open conflict within a week." "What does this have to do with the human consulate?" Marcus asked. Not demanding, not retreating, the same steady voice. "Everything, Consul. Because in 4,000 years of Sarathi succession, the Empress has always named her chosen successor through the rite of final naming. A single spoken declaration, witnessed by the full court, that carries the legal and resonance authority of the throne. The name she speaks becomes the next Empress. No challenge, no appeal, no military force can override it." "And you haven't named anyone yet?" "No, because none of the 9 claimants deserve it, and because the person I intend to name is not Sarathi." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Lyra had ever heard. She looked at her father. He was sitting very still, his hands folded, his face carrying the weight of something enormous settling onto it. Not surprise, not exactly. Something more like the moment when a long-held suspicion becomes a certainty. "Your resonance," he said carefully. "I am a human diplomat. I have no resonance frequency. I cannot sit the throne of echoes." "No," Yalvari agreed. "You cannot, but your daughter can." The room tilted. Lyra felt it physically a lurch, as though gravity had shifted direction, and she gripped the arms of her chair to keep herself upright. Both the Empress's dark eyes were fixed on her now, and in them Lyra saw something she'd never expected to see directed at her in this palace. Certainty. "That's impossible," Lyra said. Her voice came out thin and young. "I'm human. I don't have a resonance frequency. I can't." "You do." The Empress's voice was gentle. "You have had one since you were approximately 13 years old. The resonance physicians first detected it during a routine atmospheric scan of the palace. They brought it to me, assuming it was an instrument error. It was not. You have developed a resonance frequency. The first non-Sarathi being in recorded history to do so." Lyra's mind went blank, white, empty as the amber gallery in her dream. "How?" Marcus asked. His voice was steady, but his hands, Lyra noticed, had tightened on his knees. "We don't fully understand it. The physician's hypothesis is adaptation. Your daughter arrived at the palace at age 11 and has been immersed in the Ascendancy's resonance field for 12 years. Her neural pathways, younger, more plastic than an adult's, apparently began to synchronize. It is not a Sarathi frequency. It is something new, something that has never existed before." "Why wasn't I told?" Marcus's voice carried its first edge, not anger, but the controlled sharpness of a man discovering that a fact about his child had been kept from him. "Because I ordered the physicians to keep it classified, because the regents would have seen her as a threat, because the court that cannot bring itself to speak to a human diplomat would have turned its full hostility on a human girl with a resonance frequency. I protected her the only way I could by ensuring no one knew." Yalvari paused. "Including you, Consul, for which I apologize." Marcus was quiet for a long time. Lyra watched the muscles in his jaw work, watched the control that he maintained over his expression, and felt a fierce, aching love for him that made her eyes sting. "You said you intend to name her," Marcus said finally, "as your successor. As resonance heir, not Empress, not immediately." The right of final naming designates a successor who then undergoes a period of proving, typically 1 year. During the proving, she would be trained, tested, and evaluated by the court. If she passes, the throne becomes hers. If she fails, the regents choose among themselves. And the 9 claimants, the ones with private armies. The right of final naming is absolute. Once I speak her name before the court, their claims are suspended. They can challenge the proving, politically and procedurally, but they cannot override the naming itself. That is 4,000 years of law. "They'll try to destroy her," Marcus said quietly. "Yes, some of them will. And you're asking me to let you put my daughter in that position." The Empress looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Lyra. "I'm asking her." Lyra's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and focused on the pressure until the trembling stopped. Her mind was racing 12 years of court sessions, 12 years of gray tunics, 12 years of watching her father be ignored and overlooked and spoken past, 12 years of learning a language and a culture and a legal system that had never once acknowledged her existence. And beneath all of it, apparently, her own body had been quietly, impossibly, learning to resonate. "Why me?" she asked. "You have 9 claimants, you have an entire species." "I have 9 claimants who want power," Yelvari said. "I have watched them for 19 years. Regent Sorvith would use the throne to expand the military. Speaker Havani would use it to consolidate trade monopolies. Councillor Drethani would maintain order at the cost of every reform the Ascendancy needs. They are not evil. They are simply what the system produces when the only qualification for rule is ambition." She leaned forward slightly, and Lyra saw the exhaustion in her, the weight of a dying body carrying a conversation it couldn't afford to postpone. "I have watched you too, Lyra Voss, for 10 years since the physicians brought me the anomaly in your scan. I have watched you sit in the outermost ring of my court and learn every precedent, every law, every diplomatic protocol, every resonance tradition. I have watched you learn our language better than some of my own advisors speak it. I have watched you endure 12 years of being treated as invisible and respond to it the same way your father responds, by being present, being steady, and refusing to leave." "That's not a qualification," Lyra whispered. "It is the only one that matters." The words settled into her like stones dropping into deep water, and for a moment Lyra was back in the amber gallery of her dream, standing barefoot on the humming tiles, watching the Empress speak a word she couldn't hear. But this time, she heard it. "Stay." Marcus spoke into the silence. "How long do you have?" 2 months, perhaps 3. The fragmentation is accelerating. I will make the naming in the Court of Echoes in 7 days. That gives your daughter 1 week to decide." "I don't need a week," Lyra said. Both of them looked at her. Her father with his steady eyes and his careful love. The Empress with her dark, tired, certain gaze. "I'll do it." Marcus exhaled. Not a sigh, something deeper, something that had been held for longer than she could measure. He didn't argue. He didn't ask if she was sure. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her for 23 years, as though she were the most important thing in any room he'd ever stood in, and nodded once. "Then we have work to do," he said. The 7 days that followed were the most demanding of Lyra's life, and she'd spent 12 years in a palace that specialized in the demanding. The Empress arranged private sessions with the resonance physicians, discreet, conducted in sealed chambers on the 14th tier, accessible only through passages that bypassed the main corridors. They mapped Lyra's frequency with instruments that hummed against her skull and left her with headaches that lasted hours. What they found, they told her with the particular Sarathi blend of clinical precision and poorly concealed astonishment, was unprecedented. Her frequency was not a copy of a Sarathi pattern. It was something new, a hybrid resonance that incorporated elements of the collective consciousness, but filtered them through neural pathways that were fundamentally, irreducibly human. Where a Sarathi frequency resonated in harmony with the collective, Lyra's resonated alongside it, not inside the chorus but adjacent to it, like a counter-melody that gave the original new depth. It should not function, the lead physician, a tall Sarathi named Metheorus, told her during the third session. Our models cannot explain it, but it does function, and more than that, the throne of echoes responded to it during our calibration test. The throne has not responded to a new frequency in 4,000 years. What does that mean? It means you're not an anomaly, Lyra Voss. You're a precedent. While the physicians mapped her frequency, Marcus coached her on the political landscape. Night after night in their small quarters, sitting across the metal table with cups of reconstituted tea between them, he walked her through every regent, every house speaker, every alliance and enmity and grudge that shaped the Ascendancy's power structure. Regent Sorvith is the most dangerous, he told her on the third night. Military house, 3 private cruisers, strong ties to the outer ring garrisons. He's been the frontrunner for years. He won't accept a human successor without a fight. What kind of fight? Political, initially. He'll challenge the proving on procedural grounds, argue that a non-Sarathi cannot legally hold resonanceer status. He'll cite the 17th Compact, the biological origin clauses. He'll try to invalidate the naming before you ever get a chance to prove yourself. And when the political fight doesn't work, Marcus looked at her with the expression she'd learned to read at 14, the one that meant he was telling her something difficult because she deserved to know. Then he'll try other things. Dad, she reached across the table and put her hand over his. I'm not afraid of Sorvith. I know you're not, that's what worries me. On the fourth night, Marcus sat across from her in their quarters with the lights turned low, and his hands wrapped around a cup of reconstituted tea that had gone cold an hour ago. You don't have to do this, he said. I want you to know that. Whatever she's asking, whatever the court expects, you don't owe them anything. We can leave. There are posts on Varan 4 on the compact stations. We can go. Can we? He looked at her, and she saw the struggle in him, not the diplomatic composure but the father underneath. The man who had brought an 11-year-old to a palace that didn't want either of them, and had spent 12 years watching her grow up in the shadow of their indifference. Yes, he said, we can always leave. But you won't. I won't leave a post that matters. Neither will I. He set the tea down. His hands were steady, they were always steady, but his jaw worked once, and she recognized the motion from 1,000 court sessions. Marcus Voss, processing something difficult, converting it into resolve. Then we do this properly, he said, and I need you to understand something. Whatever happens in that court, whatever they say about you, whatever Sorvith tries, you do not change who you are to earn their approval. You earned it already, 12 years ago, the day you decided to stay. On the 5th day, the Empress summoned her alone. Yalvari was weaker than she'd been a week ago. Lyra could see it in the way she held herself still upright, still composed, but with a visible effort that hadn't been there before. The resonance decay markers on her forearm had spread, branching up past her elbow in dark traceries. Sit with me, the Empress said, not an order, a request. Lyra sat. They looked out the window at the crystal gardens below, where morning light fractured through engineered prisms and threw rainbows across the meditation paths. It was beautiful. It had always been beautiful. Lyra had spent 12 years watching it from below and had never seen it from this angle. When you are named, Yalvari said, the court will react in one of 3 ways. Some will be outraged, some will be confused, and some, a very few, will understand. Understand what? that the Ascendancy's greatest weakness is its certainty. We have been certain for 4,000 years that resonance is Sarathi, that the collective consciousness is ours alone, that no other species can participate in what makes us who we are. This certainty has kept us stable, but it has also kept us isolated. We do not see other species because we do not believe they can share what matters most to us. She turned to Lyra, and the exhaustion in her eyes was joined by something fiercer. Your father sat in my court for 12 years and was never seen, not because he was invisible, but because we had decided before he ever arrived that a human could not be worth seeing. That is the failure I am correcting, not with a policy change, not with a diplomatic gesture, with a name. My name. Your name, spoken from the throne of echoes with the full weight of the resonance behind it, because you are the living proof that our certainty was wrong. And the Ascendancy needs that proof more than it needs another Sarathi regent on the throne. On the 7th day, the Court of Echoes filled to capacity for the first time in 3 years. Word had spread not of the naming, which remained secret, but of the Empress's reappearance after her absence. Every seat was occupied. Every tier was full. The crystal dome overhead blazed with noon light, throwing sharp-edged shadows across the faces of 300 Sarathi delegates who had come to see their Empress and did not yet know what they were about to witness. Lyra sat beside her father in their usual seats at the outermost ring, behind the support column. She wore her gray tunic. She'd considered briefly wearing something else, something that marked the occasion, but her father had shaken his head. Wear the gray, he'd said. Let them see who you are, not who they expect. So she wore the gray, and she sat in the outer ring and she waited. The Empress entered from the upper passage, attended by 4 ceremonial guards and the regent steward. She moved slowly. The fragmentation had progressed visibly in 7 days, but she moved under her own power, and her spine was straight, and her dark eyes swept the court with the full authority of her office. The murmur that rippled through the chamber when the delegates saw the decay markers on her exposed forearms was the sound of 300 people understanding, simultaneously, that something irrevocable was happening. Yalvari took her seat on the obsidian throne. The Court of Echoes lived up to its name. Her silence carried to every tier, resonating through the ancient stone, filling the space with a presence that was more than physical. I will speak once, the Empress said, and the court went still. 19 years ago, I took this throne. I have governed the Ascendancy through trade disputes and colonial rebellions and the Kareth border crisis and the reformation of the Outer Ring Compact. I have done so imperfectly, as every Empress does, and I have done so with the full commitment of my resonance, as every Empress must. She paused. The decay markers on her forearms seemed darker against her silver skin in the noon light. 11 days ago I was diagnosed with synaptic dissolution. My governing frequency is fragmenting. Within months I will lose coherence entirely. This cannot be reversed. The sound that moved through the court was not a gasp. Sarathi didn't gasp. It was a frequency shift, a collective modulation of the resonance field that Lyra felt in her own bones. Grief, alarm, the premonition of chaos. Therefore, Yalvari continued, her voice cutting through the resonance shift like a blade through water, I invoke the right of final naming, as is my right, as is my duty, as has been done by every Empress of the Ascendancy for 4,000 years. Regent Sorvith leaned forward in his seat on the 2nd tier. His jade skin had gone pale, his dark eyes fixed on the Empress with predatory focus. Beside him, Counselor Drethani's smooth composure had cracked, revealing something raw beneath. On the far side of the chamber, Speaker Havani's hands had tightened on the arms of her chair. 9 claimants, 300 witnesses, 4,000 years of precedent about to break. Lyra felt her father's hand close over hers, not gripping, resting. The steady weight of 12 years of patience translated into a single gesture. The right of final naming is spoken once and cannot be revoked, Yelvari said. The name I speak carries the weight of this throne, the authority of my resonance, and the bond of the Ascendancy's covenant. The one I name will undergo the proving, as tradition requires. But from this moment, until the proving concludes, the named successor holds the status of resonancer, with all rights and protections thereof. She stood. The effort it cost her was visible, a tremor in her legs, a tightening of her jaw, but she stood, and the throne of echoes hummed beneath her as though responding to the act. I named Lyra Voss. The two words dropped into the court of echoes like a heartbeat into silence. 300 Sarathi faces turned toward the outermost ring, toward the support column, toward the two humans in gray and worn formal, who had sat in those seats for 12 years without complaint. Lyra stood. She didn't plan it, her body simply responded, the way it had responded 12 years ago when she'd first heard the resonance of the palace humming through the tiles beneath her feet. She stood, and as she did, she felt something in her chest, something that had been building for years, growing in silence, learning the language of a consciousness it was never supposed to share, flare to life. The throne of echoes sang. It was not a sound anyone in the court had heard in 4,000 years, not the familiar harmonic of a Sarathi successor being recognized, but something new. A frequency that wove through the collective resonance like a thread of a different color, woven into an ancient tapestry, not replacing the pattern, but completing it in a way no one had known it was incomplete. Regent Sorvath's mouth opened. No sound came out. Beside him, two military advisors exchanged a look of naked disbelief. On the lower tiers, lesser delegates were on their feet, their faces carrying every shade of shock and confusion, and in a very few, the dawning recognition that the Empress had promised. Councillor Drethani, the smooth regent steward who had presided in Yelvari's absence, rose from his secondary platform. His face was unreadable. He looked at Lyra for a long moment, looked at her the way the court had never looked at her, as a person rather than an inconvenience, and then he did something that silenced the chamber more completely than the throne song had. He bowed. Not a political bow, not a diplomatic courtesy, a full Sarathi obeisance, one knee to the ground, head inclined, the gesture reserved for the recognition of legitimate resonance authority. A single voice rose from the third tier. Speaker Methys, a younger delegate, one of the few who had occasionally acknowledged Marcus Voss's presence with a nod, spoke the formal words of witness. The naming is spoken, the throne has answered, let the proving begin. The formula was ancient, and it broke the spell. A cascade of responses followed, some formal, some whispered, some tight with barely contained fury. Regent Sorvath remained seated, his dark eyes fixed on Lyra with an intensity that promised everything the next months would contain. But the naming was spoken. The throne had answered, and 4,000 years of law stood between his ambition and Lyra Voss. In the chaos of the court's response, Lyra looked down at her father. Marcus Voss sat in his chair behind the support column in his mendied suit with his hands folded in his lap. His face was composed, his eyes were steady, and for the first time in 12 years they were wet. Not crying, not Marcus Voss, not in public, not ever, but wet. The sheen of a man watching his daughter become something impossible and recognizing, in the same moment, that every day of those 12 years, every ignored brief, every unanswered petition, every session of being talked through and looked past had been, in some way he could never have planned, the thing that taught her how to stand in a room full of people who didn't see her and remain standing. The Empress descended from her dais. She moved slowly, the guards hovering at her elbows, but she waved them back when she reached the outermost ring. She stopped in front of Marcus Voss. "Consul," she said, and then, in a voice that the court of echoes carried to every seat, every tier, every corner of the ancient chamber, "I see you." 3 words. In the Sarathi language, They carried a weight that defied translation. "I see you" was not an observation but a declaration, the acknowledgement of another being's full resonance presence, reserved for those considered worthy of the speaker's deepest recognition. In 19 years on the throne, Yalvari had spoken those words to fewer than 10 people. Marcus looked up at her. The Empress of the Sarathi Ascendancy, silver-skinned and dying, standing before a human diplomat who had waited 12 years for a single moment of being seen. "Your resonance," he said. "I never needed you to see me. I only needed to be worth seeing." The Empress's dark eyes glistened. She extended her hand, palm up, the Sarathi gesture of equal recognition, the one Lyra had never seen offered to any non-Sarathi in any record she'd studied. Marcus took it. Lyra watched from above, standing where the court could see her, the resonance humming in her chest, and thought, "This is what 12 years of staying looks like from the other side." The days after the naming were a siege conducted in conference rooms and corridors. Regent Sorvith filed his challenge within hours, a formal objection, citing the 17th Compact's biological origin clauses, arguing that a non-Sarathi being could not hold resonanceer status regardless of frequency compatibility. The legal scholars convened. The debate would take weeks. Meanwhile, Sorvith's allies began a quieter campaign, whispered doubts about the integrity of the physician's scans, implications that the frequency had been fabricated, suggestions that the Empress's judgment had been compromised by the dissolution. Lyra faced it the way her father had taught her to face everything, by being present. She attended every court session. She sat in the seat the Empress had reassigned her, not the outermost ring now, but the inner circle, in the chair traditionally reserved for the resonanceer, directly facing the dais. She wore the gray tunic. The regents who would have ignored her a month ago were forced to address her directly, and she answered them in flawless Sarathi, with a grasp of legal precedent that made more than one of them reconsider their assumptions. The proving's first challenge came on the 9th day, a public demonstration of resonance compatibility with the throne. Sorvith had demanded it, clearly expecting Lyra to fail. The resonance physicians set up their instruments in the Court of Echoes, and 300 delegates watched as Lyra placed her hands on the throne's obsidian surface. The frequency that emerged was recorded by every instrument in the chamber and would be debated by scholars for decades. It was not Sarathi. It was not human. It was something that had no name, yet a resonance that belonged to neither species alone, but could only have been born from the intersection of both. The physician's instruments registered it as stable, coherent, and compatible with the throne's governing matrix. The chamber did not erupt. Eruption was not the Sarathi way. Instead, the silence that followed carried a frequency of its own, the collective resonance of 300 minds, adjusting to a reality that contradicted everything they had believed about themselves. Sorvith's challenge did not collapse, but it lost its foundation. The 17th Compact's biological origin clauses had been written in an era when no one had imagined a non-Sarathi frequency was possible. The precedent didn't fit because the precedent had never needed to exist. The legal scholars began drafting new frameworks, and in their debates, Lyra heard something she'd never heard in the Court of Echoes before: genuine uncertainty. Not the smooth certainty of a culture that had decided all its answers 4,000 years ago, but the uncertain, fertile confusion of a culture encountering something genuinely new. It was, she realized, the most Sarathi thing she'd ever witnessed, because the Ascendancy's resonance consciousness was, at its core, a mechanism for incorporating new information. It had simply never been asked to incorporate information this fundamental. The second month brought harder tests. Sorvith shifted tactics, moving from legal challenges to political isolation. His military allies blockaded the shuttle corridor to the Outer Ring colonies, denying Lyra the diplomatic tour that were traditionally part of the proving. The blockade was framed as a security measure, protecting the resonance air from unvetted colonial elements. But its purpose was transparent. Cut her off from the constituencies she'd need to govern, demonstrate that military power trumped resonance authority. Marcus countered by reaching out to the colonial administrators directly, using 12 years of quiet relationship building that no one in the court had noticed. He didn't send formal briefs this time. He sent personal messages, asking after Administrator Velthani's daughter's recovery, congratulating Administrator Sareth on his colony's water reclamation milestone, checking whether Administrator Rayan had received the agricultural data Marcus had compiled for her 6 months ago, and that she'd never acknowledged receiving. A dozen administrators who had never responded to his official briefs responded now, because Marcus Voss had spent 12 years learning their names, their families, their concerns not as a strategy, but because that was who he was. Sorveth discovered the back-channel communications on the 38th day and confronted Marcus in the processional bridge corridor, flanked by 2 military aides whose ceremonial armor was polished to a sharp gleam. "You are undermining the security protocols of this palace," Sorveth said. His jade skin was flushed darker at the throat, a Sarathi indicator of controlled anger. Marcus stopped walking. He did not step back. He did not raise his voice. He looked at Sorveth with the same expression he'd worn for 12 years, the listening face, the patient eyes, the composure that asked nothing and conceded nothing. "I am corresponding with colonial administrators about agricultural data," Marcus said, "as I have done for 12 years. You are welcome to review the messages. Your daughter's claim to this throne is illegitimate. The legal scholars disagree. The legal scholars can be replaced." Marcus paused. The corridor was empty except for the 4 of them, Marcus, Sorveth, and the 2 aides. The morning light from the crystal dome fell across the bridge in broken patterns. "Regent," Marcus said quietly, "I have been spoken to as though I don't exist for 12 years. I have been spoken past, spoken around, and spoken through. I have never once raised my voice about it, but I will tell you this. My daughter's name was spoken by a dying empress with the full weight of 4,000 years of law behind it. If you intend to overturn that, you will need something more persuasive than 2 aides and a corridor." Sorveth's dark eyes narrowed. One of the aides shifted his weight, the moment balanced on an edge. Then Sorveth turned and walked away. His aides followed. The corridor was empty again, and Marcus Voss stood on the processional bridge with the light falling around him. And his hands, Lyra noticed from the gallery above where she'd been watching without his knowledge, were perfectly steady. The Empress weakened steadily. Each time Lyra was summoned to the 14th tier, Yalvari was a little thinner, her silver skin a little more translucent, the decay markers a little more extensive. But her mind remained sharp, and in their private conversations, she gave Lyra the education that no proving test could replicate. "You will be tempted to prove yourself by becoming Sarathi," Yalvari told her during one of their last sessions. "Don't. The Ascendancy doesn't need another Sarathi Empress. It needs what you are, someone who can hear our resonance and still think in a frequency we've never known. That is your strength. The moment you abandon it, you become just another regent." "I'm not a regent," Lyra said. "No, you're something we don't have a word for yet. Make one." On the 52nd day, Sorveth made his most dangerous move. A formal petition arrived at the Court of Echoes signed by Sorveth, co-signed by 4 of the other 8 claimants, and endorsed by the commanders of 2 outer ring garrisons. The petition invoked an obscure provision of the Third Era Compact, the right of military intercession during a contested succession. It did not explicitly call for Lyra's removal. It called for the resonance heir to submit to a resonance stability evaluation, conducted not by the Empress's physicians, but by military-appointed specialists from Sorveth's own house. The implication was clear. Military specialists could declare her frequency unstable, An unstable resonancer could be removed from the proving on medical grounds. The precedent was thin. It had been invoked exactly once, 800 years ago, against a claimant who was genuinely incapacitated, but it existed, and Sorvith had found it. Lyra received the petition in the resonanceur's chamber, read it twice, and then walked to the Court of Echoes unannounced. The session was in progress, a routine trade hearing, sparsely attended, perhaps 100 delegates. She entered through the main passage, which meant every face in the chamber turned toward her as she walked down the central aisle toward the dais. She did not take the resonanceur's seat. She walked to the center of the floor, directly below the dais, and held up the petition. Regent Sorvith has petitioned for a military resonance evaluation of the resonancer, she said. Her voice carried through the chamber's acoustics, clear and steady. I accept. The murmur that followed was immediate. Sorvith, who had been seated on the second tier, rose to his feet with an expression that Lyra read as genuine surprise. He had expected her to fight the petition, to delay, to seek a legal counter. He had not expected her to walk into the court and accept. I accept, Lyra repeated, on one condition. The evaluation will be conducted here in the Court of Echoes before the full court, not in a military chamber, not behind sealed doors. Every delegate, every speaker, every regent will witness the results. If the military specialists declare my frequency unstable, I will step down. If they declare it stable, the petition is withdrawn permanently, and no further resonance challenges may be brought for the remainder of the proving. Sorvith's mouth worked. The condition stripped away his advantage. A private military evaluation could be manipulated. A public one before the full court could not. He looked at his co-signers. Two of them were already sinking back into their seats, with the body language of people who had signed something, without reading the consequences. Agreed, Sorvith said, because refusing would have cost him more than accepting. The evaluation took place 3 days later. The military specialists, 2 physicians from House Sorvith who arrived in formal military dress and carried instruments that gleamed with hostile precision, set up their equipment on the dais while the full court watched. Lyra sat in a stone chair that had been carried from the archives specifically for the purpose, and the specialists attached resonance monitors to her temples, her wrists, her sternum. The evaluation lasted 40 minutes. The specialists ran every test their instruments allowed: frequency coherence, amplitude stability, harmonic integration, synaptic response time, collective field compatibility. The data streamed across holographic displays visible to the entire chamber. When the specialists finished, the senior physician, a tall Sarathi woman with dark emerald skin, and the rigid posture of someone whose findings had betrayed her employer, removed the monitors from Lyra's temples and stepped back. The frequency is stable, she said. Her voice carried a note of something that Lyra recognized from her father's diplomatic career, the tone of a professional compelled by the evidence to contradict her patron. More than stable. The integration metrics exceed the baseline threshold for resonancer compatibility by a factor of 3. The court was silent for 4 full seconds. Then Speaker Methys, the young delegate from the 3rd tier, spoke again. The evaluation is concluded. The petition is withdrawn. Sorvith did not speak. He sat in his 2nd-tier seat with his jade hands folded and his dark eyes fixed on a point somewhere above Lyra's head, and the military aides beside him were very still. On the 63rd day, Empress Yelvari's frequency went silent. Lyra felt it happen. She was in the meditation garden on the 7th tier, reviewing colonial trade records on a data slate, while the afternoon light filtered through the crystal canopy above. The resonance in her chest, the hybrid frequency she'd carried for 10 years without knowing its name, the frequency that the physicians had mapped and the throne had answered, shifted. Not a sound, an absence. The removal of a note from a chord she'd been hearing so long she'd forgotten it was separate from her own heartbeat. She set the data slate down on the stone bench. The The crystal garden was empty except for a single palace attendant tending the prism arrays at the far end. The attendant paused, turned, and looked at Lyra with wide, dark eyes. They had felt it too, the collective resonance field rippling outward from the 14th tier like a wave receding from a shore. Lyra knew, before the messenger reached her. Before the bells began their long descending toll from the palace's highest tower, each tone lower than the last, falling through the harmonic scale in the Sarathi sequence that meant an empress had departed. Before the court of echoes filled with the sound of 300 Sarathi frequencies modulating into the formal harmonic of mourning, a sound Lyra had studied in recordings and never expected to hear in person, a sound that moved through the resonance field like grief-given architecture. She stood. The attendant at the far end of the garden knelt not to Lyra, but to the loss. Lyra walked past without speaking, because there were no words for this, not in Sarathi and not in any human language she knew. She went to the 14th tier. The guards let her pass without checking her scroll. In the private audience chamber, the morning light fell across the empty chair, and Marcus Voss stood by the window, looking out at the crystal gardens with his hands clasped behind his back. "She's gone," he said. Lyra stood beside him. Below, the gardens threw rainbows that caught in the prisms and scattered across the meditation paths. She thought of the amber gallery dream, the Empress speaking a word she couldn't hear, the gallery shattering into light. She could hear the word now. It had always been her name. "The proving isn't finished," she said. "No, but the naming stands. The court will either accept you or tear itself apart." Sorvith. He's already moving, his cruisers repositioned overnight. He'll frame it as a protective measure stability during the transition, but he's testing whether anyone will stop him. Will they? Marcus looked at her. His steady eyes, his weathered face, his 12 years of patience concentrated into a single expression. That depends on you. She convened the court of echoes within the hour. This time, she did not sit in the resonanceur's chair. She stood on the dais, beside the throne of echoes, in her gray tunic, and looked out at the faces of 300 Sarathi who were trying to decide whether to follow a human into their future. Regent Sorvith spoke first, as she'd expected. He rose from the second tier, his jade skin catching the noon light, his military bearing communicating everything his words chose not to. "The proving is incomplete," he declared. "The succession cannot be confirmed on the basis of an unfinished process. I move that the regents convene a succession council to determine." "Regent Sorvith." Lyra's voice cut through his, and she felt the court of echoes amplify it not mechanically, but through the resonance itself, her frequency carried by the ancient stone the way a Sarathi Empress's frequency had always been carried. "I hear your objection. I acknowledge your right to voice it, and I ask you to sit down." He stared at her. The court waited. "The right of final naming is absolute," Lyra continued. "It was spoken by Empress Yelvari in this chamber, witnessed by the full court, answered by the throne. 63 days ago, you challenged its legal basis, and the legal scholars found no grounds for invalidation. 22 days ago, you challenged my resonance compatibility, and the physicians confirmed it before 300 witnesses. 12 days ago, you blocked my access to the Outer Ring colonies, and the colonial administrators restored it themselves, because my father spent 12 years building relationships that no one in this court valued enough to notice." She paused. The silence had a different quality now, not the smooth certainty of a culture in control, but the ragged, honest silence of a culture in transition. "I am not Sarathi. I will never be Sarathi. But I have spent 12 years in this palace, learning your language and your law and your resonance traditions, and I have spent 12 years watching a man who never asked to be seen, only to be worthy of seeing. That is the qualification the Empress recognized. Not my frequency, not my species, my willingness to stay in a room that did not want me and to remain worthy of the chair I was given." She looked at Sorvith. He was standing very still, his military bearing holding, but something in his dark eyes had shifted, not defeat, not acceptance, but the recognition that the argument he'd prepared did not apply to the argument she was making. "I don't ask you to follow me because I have power," Lyra said. "I ask you to follow me because I have stayed. And I will continue to stay through the proving, through the challenges, through every test this court requires, because that is what my father taught me. You stay, and you let the staying speak." She placed her hand on the throne of echoes. The frequency that rose through the court was hers, not Sarathi, not human, but the new thing, the unnamed thing, the frequency that belonged to a girl who had grown up in the spaces between two species and had become something neither could have produced alone. It moved through the resonance field like morning light through a crystal garden, not replacing what was there but revealing colors that had always been present and never been seen. Counselor Drethani knelt again. This time he was not alone. Speaker Methys followed the young delegate from the third tier, the one who had spoken the ancient formula at the naming, the one who had declared the military petition withdrawn. She knelt with the deliberate grace of someone who had decided this long before today and had been waiting for the moment to arrive. Behind her, 3 members of the Resonance Physicians Guild descended from the upper tiers and knelt on the court floor. Dr. Methurus, the lead physician who had first mapped Lyra's frequency and called her a precedent, rather than an anomaly, knelt with her instruments still clipped to her belt, as though she might need to take readings at any moment. The 2 colonial administrators who had traveled from the outer ring to attend the session knelt side by side, their formal robes pooling on the ancient stone. One by one, then in clusters, then in waves, the delegates rose and knelt. Not all of them. Sorvith remained standing, his face a mask, his military advisors flanking him like pillars. But enough, more than enough. The sound of the court shifting, chairs scraping, robes rustling, frequencies modulating into a harmonic that had no precedent and no name filled the chamber like a tide coming in. From the outermost ring, behind the support column that no one would bother to move again, because the seat would soon be empty, Marcus Voss watched his daughter stand on the dais of the Court of Echoes, in her gray tunic, with her hand on a 4,000-year-old throne, and the expression on his face was the one Lyra had been reading since she was 11 years old. Not pride exactly, not triumph. Something quieter and more permanent, the face of a man who had spent 12 years answering indifference with presence, and who could see now, from the outermost ring where he had always been content to sit, that presence was the only answer that had ever mattered. In the resonance field that connected 300 Sarathi minds and one impossible human frequency, a new harmonic settled into place, not replacing the old ones, not overwriting them, but adding a voice that the chorus had needed without knowing it was missing. Lyra Voss, daughter of the human consul, stood on the dais of the Court of Echoes and did not move. She stayed,